The story began in the middle of a chaotic and merciless war upon a frozen battlefield, where blizzards roared across the land and the ground was stained with endless bloodshed. At the center of that devastation stood a man suffering from a fatal wound, coughing blood as the sacred sword of the Order pierced straight through his heart. Around him, the soldiers of the Sacred Sword Order, though carrying only minor injuries themselves, gasped heavily in relief after finally defeating the enemy they had feared for an entire decade. That man was Archmond, the necromancer known throughout the continent as the Devil of Death itself, and even he understood that his life was already nearing its end. The great continental war that had consumed the world for 10 long years had finally reached its conclusion through a joint operation where the Imperial Army led the vanguard while an elite force infiltrated deep behind enemy lines. Archmond had anticipated such a strategy and constructed countless defensive lines across the frozen north, but despite all of his preparations, everything ultimately collapsed in the end. His total defeat came because of a single knight, the leader of the Northern Knights, Burkel Rhineland. Yet Burkel did not accept the victory for himself alone. He calmly told Archmond that he had never fought alone, and that only after countless soldiers shed their blood and sacrificed their lives holding the line was his sword finally able to reach the Necromancer. Burkel urged Archmond to surrender and allow peace to finally return to the continent, but Archmond answered him with nothing but hatred. With blood pouring from his lips and fury burning within his eyes, he shouted for Burkel to shut his mouth. He roared that the Order had merely stood by and watched while people died helplessly during the plague. Yet now they dared cry out for peace, after the world had already been destroyed. To Archmond, the knights who preached justice were nothing more than hypocritical beasts hiding behind righteous words. As a dark green aura gathered violently within his trembling hand, Archmond declared that he would personally slaughter every last human on the continent. The soldiers of the Sacred Sword Order froze in horror after realizing that even in his current condition, Archmond was still capable of using necromancy. One of the soldiers desperately warned Burkel that they needed to kill him immediately before another disaster was unleashed. But unexpectedly, Burkel ordered everyone to stand down. He then explained to Archmond that 20 million people had fallen victim to the plague, and that Archmond had used necromancy to raise those dead into an army, becoming the very spark that ignited the Great Continental War. Yet Archmond merely laughed bitterly and asked whether Burkel truly believed he was ignorant of how many had died. He coldly stated that his own people were likely among those 20 million victims, and that the world simply wanted revenge upon him for what had happened. Burkel remained silent in response, unable to deny those words. After several moments of silence, Burkel finally revealed the true reason he had come to the battlefield. It was not for glory, revenge, or recognition, but for the future of the children who would inherit the continent after the war ended. Hearing those words caused Archmond's body to freeze for a brief moment. Burkel calmly explained that a man's choices, convictions, and hopes were things that needed to be passed on to the next generation, and that everything he fought for existed solely for the future waiting beyond the war. In that instant, Archmond saw his own reflection within Burkel's eyes. The hatred and corruption consuming him were completely different from the gaze of a knight who fought for the sake of those who would come after him. For the first time in many years, Archmond felt utterly defeated, not by strength, but by conviction itself. Slowly falling to his knees, Archmond lowered his head and asked Burkel to finish him. However, to everyone's shock, Burkel suddenly dropped his holy sword onto the frozen ground. A knight behind him immediately demanded to know what he was doing, but Burkel ignored him and instead drew another blade from his waist, one engraved with glowing purple runes that pulsed with ominous energy. Holding that strange sword toward the dying necromancer, Burkel asked for Archmond's final words. Archmond remained silent for several moments, before quietly muttering that necromancers did not die so easily. Before he could finish speaking, Burkel swung the blade without hesitation and severed his head completely. Archmond's head spun through the air before crashing against the frozen earth. The moment it touched the ground, the soldiers erupted into celebration after finally witnessing the death of the devil of the continent. Beyond the distant cheers and cries of victory, Archmond heard only the sound of his own head striking the snow. Thus, the 10-year-long Great Continental War came to an end with the death of Archmond the Necromancer. The scene then shifted toward a massive mansion during a gloomy and rain-filled night. Lightning flashed endlessly across the dark clouds, while thunder echoed through the heavens like the roar of the world itself. Inside one of the chambers, a maid suddenly asked her companion if she had just seen the young master's mouth move. Archmond, now trapped within the body of a newborn baby, could not understand what was happening or where he was. Another maid gently called him young Master Klein and asked whether he had slept well. One of the maids then showed him a pendant containing the portrait of a beautiful woman, explaining that she was the Duchess and his mother, before encouraging him to say the word mother. However, his body felt stiff and unresponsive, and although he tried to speak, the words would not come out properly. Even so, the maids became excited simply because the baby was already capable of making sounds. Yet the moment the child opened his mouth again, darkness seemed to spread through the room itself. In a distorted voice, the baby suddenly began chanting the incantation for necromancy, summoning the guardians of darkness and the soldiers of death. while declaring himself to be Archmond. The maids widened their eyes in absolute terror and dropped the pendant onto the floor. At that exact moment, a massive bolt of lightning tore through the sky outside the mansion as though the world itself had answered the child's call. Thunder exploded across the heavens while rain poured endlessly upon the estate. 15 years later, the same mansion stood beneath a peaceful and sunny sky. Several maids watched from afar with eyes full of admiration as a young man walked gracefully through the garden paths. His white hair shimmered beneath the sunlight, while his sharp gaze and flawless appearance made him seem more like a masterpiece sculpted by the gods than an ordinary human. The maids could not stop whispering about how handsome young Master Klein had become, wondering what he possibly ate to possess such unreal beauty. Yet Klein himself remained completely indifferent to their endless praise. Suddenly, an old man carrying a bucket of holy water appeared behind him, loudly announcing that he had finally found Klein. Without hesitation, the man dumped the entire bucket over Klein's head, while declaring that the evil spirit should be purified immediately. This old man was Veerman, a priest belonging to the Holy Order garrison. For a brief moment, Veerman had sensed a gaze within Klein identical to the one Archman possessed long ago, and to him that alone was enough reason to continue the purification ritual. According to the priest, 3 maids had already become bewitched by Klein's appearance, meaning the purification had arrived just in time. Klein coldly responded that it was not easy to confidently spout such insane nonsense for years without growing tired of it. However, Veerman firmly insisted that the rituals were necessary because Archman's soul supposedly rested inside Klein's body. Before Klein could properly defend himself, the priest sprayed even more holy water directly into his face, after claiming he had once again seen Archman's expression appear. At that moment, Klein could only wonder if Veerman was genuinely insane. As he slowly backed away from the priest, he repeatedly muttered under his breath that Veerman was nothing more than a lunatic. Unfortunately, before Klein could escape, the priest ordered several men to seize him and drag him away. Veerman then announced that Klein's insolence deserved punishment, and that he would receive a full holy water bath completely naked. Klein desperately protested while running, once again insisting that he was not Archmond and that his name was Klein. Yet his protests meant nothing to the priest, who continued believing that the Necromancer's spirit still lingered within him. Submerged inside the freezing holy water, Klein silently reflected upon his miserable situation. Even now, he still could not understand how everything had turned out this way. He clearly remembered his death that day on the battlefield. His head had unquestionably been severed from his body, yet when he opened his eyes again, he found himself reincarnated as a baby. To make matters worse, the very first words he spoke after reincarnating had been Archman's own necromancy incantation. Because of that single mistake, everyone immediately treated him like a demon, and by the age of 3, he had already been locked away inside a monastery. That was also where he first met Veerman, the priest of the Holy Order garrison, though Klein never imagined that meeting him would become the beginning of endless suffering. From that day onward, his life became nothing but one brutal purification ritual after another. He endured 24-hour prayer chants without sleep, freezing garlic baths that nearly killed him from the cold, and even so-called purification fire ceremonies that resembled torture more than religion. Year after year, he was forced to suffer through countless inhuman trials under the excuse of cleansing evil spirits. 5 years later, Klein sat quietly on the floor wearing a ridiculous party hat while looking completely discouraged. His personal maid, Erin, sincerely prayed for him to honor the glorious lineage of heroes belonging to the family. However, Klein had long grown irritated by such speeches, and before she could finish, he pulled the hat from his head and threw it onto the ground. Erin looked heartbroken as he informed him that the hat is personally made. Realizing he had acted too harshly, Klein immediately apologized and decided to pick it back up. Yet the moment he stood, his expression instantly twisted into complete disgust and horror after hearing a familiar voice calling his name from behind. Veerman stared at him with tears in his eyes after witnessing Klein wearing the hat he had spent an entire week knitting himself. The priest claimed he was deeply moved by the sight. Hearing that revelation caused Klein's expression to darken immediately. Without hesitation, he tore the hat apart with a smile and calmly declared that he would never wear another hat again for the rest of his life. Veerman instantly shouted that Archman's evil spirit had appeared once more, but Klein no longer even bothered responding properly. Instead, he simply stated that he wanted the guilt he had briefly felt earlier to disappear completely while cursing the priest in his mind. At that moment, the door opened, and the captain of the Red Chariot Knight Order entered the room. His name was Dunkel, and he asked whether the purification ritual had finally ended. Dunkel mentioned that the rumor claiming young Master Klein was Archmond had already persisted for over 10 years, yet even the Holy Order itself had concluded there was nothing wrong with him anymore. Hearing those words caused Veerman to immediately change his attitude and agree politely before casually tossing Klein onto the floor, as though nothing had happened. Watching this, Klein realized that the priest never listened to a single word he said, yet instantly became cooperative whenever a knight captain spoke. In Klein's eyes, Veerman was surprisingly talented at politics. Veerman then prepared to leave the room, though before exiting completely, he suddenly turned back with a serious expression and warned them that there was always a possibility. He then reminded Klein that the next purification ritual would take place on Friday, before telling him to wash thoroughly and keep both his body and mind pure while waiting. Klein furiously yelled at him to leave already. After the priest finally departed, Klein collapsed onto the sofa in exhaustion, while wondering whether someone like Veerman was truly allowed to call himself a priest, despite openly torturing children. To him, the man looked less like a holy servant, and more like some terrifying muscle demon wearing religious robes. Aaron then gently handed Klein a towel, before quietly asking once more whether he truly was not Archmond. Klein immediately denied it again, adding that he hated even hearing that name. Deep down, however, he knew that admitting the truth would only lead to even worse torture in the future. For now, all he wanted was enough freedom to recover his strength, yet ever since his reincarnation he had lived under constant surveillance. Because of the rumors surrounding him, he spent 7 entire years imprisoned within a monastery, before finally returning to the Duke's estate, only to end up trapped under the watch of yet another fanatic priest. Dunkel then explained that although Veerman appeared to be an ordinary priest, he was actually an executor of the Holy Order. Aaron curiously asked what an executor was, and whether such a title held importance. Dunkel nodded and explained that executors were monsters acknowledged as the strongest warriors within the Order. Individuals so powerful that almost nobody could defeat them except the Duke himself. Hearing that immediately excited Aaron, who proudly exclaimed that the Duke of their household must therefore be incredibly powerful. She then innocently asked Klein which Duke in the family he considered the strongest. Without hesitation, Klein answered that the strongest was the first Duke. Dunkel paused briefly before reminding him that his own father, the current 7th Duke, was also an exceptional figure. Yet Klein calmly repeated that the strongest remained the first Duke. Dunkel eventually accepted the answer with a respectful nod. Aaron then happily explained that Klein had always admired the first Duke the most, pointing out that he constantly stared toward the founder's portrait hanging within the mansion. However, the truth hidden within Klein's heart was completely different. Dunkel mentioned that nearly 200 years had passed since the first Duke established the family, yet hearing those words only deepened Klein's complicated emotions. Even after all this time, he still struggled to believe reality itself. After everything that had happened, Archmond the Necromancer had been reincarnated not as a commoner, nor as a forgotten soul wandering the world, but as a direct descendant of the very man who had killed him 2 centuries ago. The scene shifted back toward the final moments of the Great Continental War, as Archmond shouted the name of his greatest enemy, Berkel Rhineland, while blood poured endlessly from his body upon the frozen battlefield. In those final moments before death claimed him, Berkel's words echoed once more within his mind, the words about why he had chosen to stand against him until the very end. It was not for glory, revenge, or honor, but for the future of the children who would inherit the continent after the war. As Archmond's severed head crashed against the frozen ground, the world around him faded into darkness. Suddenly, Klein jolted awake from his bed, gasping heavily for air as sweat covered his entire body. His breathing was rough and uneven after reliving the same nightmare once again. Sitting upright while trying to calm himself, he muttered that it had only been another bad dream before silently recalling his past identity as Archmond, the legendary necromancer feared across the continent as the Devil of Death. Though all of it belonged to the distant past now, he had once nearly destroyed the entire continent in a fit of uncontrollable rage before ultimately being killed by the sword of the Northern Knight, Berkel Rhineland. Yet when he opened his eyes again after death, 200 years had already passed, and he had been reborn as a descendant of the very man who killed him, all while retaining every memory from his previous life. As Klein quietly muttered that he still could not get used to his white hair, a familiar voice suddenly interrupted him from nearby. Veerman informed him that he had been talking in his sleep again, and casually asked whether he had perhaps been dreaming about his time as Archmond. To Klein, Priest Garrison Veerman was nothing less than a complete lunatic who had spent years tormenting him, because he was fully convinced that Archmond's soul still lived inside him. Because of that, Klein had no choice but to continue pretending to be ignorant in front of this insane priest. Klein quickly claimed that he had simply been tired lately, but before the situation could calm down, Aaron suddenly crawled out from underneath his bed and excitedly announced that she had heard everything young Master Klein had been saying in his sleep. She began imitating him while dramatically talking about destroying the continent and killing everyone, before adding that Klein had even called himself Archmond. Klein immediately panicked and desperately tried to stop her while asking when he had ever said anything like that. Meanwhile, Veerman remained completely silent. The silence itself made the atmosphere even more terrifying. At that moment, the butler knocked on Klein's door and introduced himself as Berkman, before informing him that the swordsmanship demonstration would soon begin. However, before the butler could continue speaking, Veerman calmly thanked Aaron for faithfully reporting everything to him. His eyes suddenly glowed ominously, while a creepy aura spread throughout the room as he informed Klein that his purification ritual time would now be doubled. Completely horrified by the thought, Klein immediately covered Aaron's mouth and begged Veerman not to ruin his life any further while once again calling him a crazy priest. As they walked through the hallway afterward, Klein asked about the swordsmanship demonstration. Berkman explained that the Duke had personally ordered Klein to attend this year's exhibition as well. While Klein continued questioning whether his father truly wanted him there, Aaron casually interrupted to ask if she could receive snacks afterward. Berkman immediately scolded her for making another rude request, but Klein stopped him and defended Aaron, pointing out how much she genuinely liked the cookies. Even so, Klein remained confused about the entire situation, because his father had never once summoned him to attend such an event before. Berkman then explained that the collateral collateral branches of the family had arrived for a visit. The collateral branches were relatives who did not belong to the direct bloodline of the Rhineland family, but to Klein, they were little more than pests gathering around a dying house. The moment he arrived, several men immediately began mocking him. One of them casually called him Klein, while another laughed and suggested they should call him Lord Archmond instead. The group burst into laughter together while joking about how the second son of the Rhineland family had apparently rotted away inside a monastery for 7 years. One of them mockingly asked whether Klein had any interesting stories to share from his years locked away, while another blonde-haired man warned his friend to be careful, or Klein might place a curse on him. Klein quietly observed them while internally identifying who they were. The two men insulting him were maternal cousins, while the chubbier men nearby belonged to the distant northern branch family. He also noticed several cousins from the western branch among the crowd. Off to the side stood a lone blonde-haired girl quietly watching the situation unfold. Suddenly, one of the cousins shouted toward Klein and asked whether he had gone deaf, questioning whether someone like him truly belonged within the Rhineland family. Klein ignored them entirely and simply looked away, but his silence only irritated them further. They angrily demanded that he pay attention while reminding him that his supposed superiors were speaking to him, yet Klein could not even remember their names. To him, the reason these strangers from the collateral branches acted so boldly was painfully obvious. The family he had been reborn into was slowly collapsing. The fact that distant relatives openly looked down on a direct descendant already proved how weak the Rhineland household had become. Soon afterward, the swordsmanship exhibition finally began as two young knights stepped into the arena to face one another. One of them called out to his opponent, Delane, urging him to stop holding back and fight seriously for once. Delane calmly apologized to Dalton before stating that the match was already over. Dalton angrily shouted that he was not defeated yet, but Delane merely asked whether he was truly certain, because things would only become more difficult from this point onward. Klein quietly explained to himself that the Rhineland family now possessed only one remaining hope, his half-brother and the eldest son of the household, Delane Rhineland. Delane was a genius prodigy whose overwhelming talent was the sole reason the Rhineland family still maintained its reputation as a bloodline of master swordsmen. As Dalton rushed forward while declaring that this battle would end differently than before, Klein's eyes sharpened with interest. It was the first time he had ever witnessed the swordsmanship of this family with his current body. Dalton thrust his wooden sword toward Delane, but in the next instant Delane completely vanished from his sight. At the exact same moment, Delane appeared behind him while surging forward at incredible speed, his body wrapped in a blazing yellow aura. Klein's eyes glinted once more, and this time he could see everything clearly. He could see the precise footwork, the timing of the acceleration, the flow of mana, and the exact trajectory of the strike. In that instant, he realized that this was the Rhineland family's secret technique, the meteor sword. With Dalton's weapon knocked away effortlessly, Delane calmly declared the match over and reminded him that he had already warned him earlier. The surrounding crowd erupted into amazement while asking whether what they had just witnessed was truly the meteor sword. Others praised Delane for successfully displaying such a difficult technique before so many people. Klein immediately understood the deeper meaning behind the performance. Delane had not simply shown off his talent. He had issued a warning to every collateral branch present there, a declaration that the Rhineland family was still strong enough to stand above them. However, while observing the battle, Klein began noticing that something about his own eyes felt strangely different. Delane soon noticed Klein watching from the sidelines and approached him with a smile, asking how long he had been standing there. Klein replied that he had only just arrived, causing Delane to warmly remark that he would have fought even harder had he known his younger brother was watching. In Klein's eyes, Delane was nearly perfect. He possessed overwhelming talent, exceptional looks, and a genuinely good personality. Klein then quietly asked why the collateral branches had truly come this time, wondering whether they were simply here to squeeze more money from the family again. Before Delane could answer, another man suddenly interrupted, while praising Delane's excellent performance and mastery of the family's secret swordsmanship. This man was Heinkel Rhineland, the 7th Duke of Rhineland, the current head of the household and Klein's father. To Heinkel, Delane was likely the final remaining fragment of hope for the family. Another nobleman standing nearby praised Delane's enormous mana capacity and precise control, stating that no knight his age should even be capable of attempting such a technique. Delane humbly accepted the praise and admitted that he still had much further to go, but before he could continue, Heinkel firmly reminded him that a knight of Rhineland must always stand as the greatest in the empire. Those words, he explained, were the final teachings left behind by the first Duke, Berkel Rhineland himself. He then ordered Delane to engrave those words into his heart and continue moving forward no matter what. Afterward, Heinkel finally turned his attention toward Klein with a calm expression. Klein remained silent as his father placed a hand on his head, before quietly stating that he could not sense even the slightest trace of mana within him. Klein immediately apologized. Deep inside, he understood something very clearly. Anger, discipline, and expectations were reserved only for those with talent. Since he possessed none, he was nothing more than a worthless burden in his father's eyes. One of the attendants nearby then asked the Duke to forgive Klein, reminding him that the young master had spent the most important years of his childhood imprisoned within a monastery. Heinkel fell silent after hearing that. Meanwhile, members of the collateral branches immediately began whispering among themselves about how the second son of the Rhineland family possessed no mana at all. Some openly declared that Klein was nothing compared to his older brother, while others claimed they had long suspected that the direct bloodline itself had become incompetent. Some even questioned whether the 7th Duke still possessed enough strength to protect the family, insisting that the collateral branches would soon need to take control themselves. Klein normally would not have cared about such insults, but the moment he remembered Burkel's words about fighting for the future of the children, something inside him became furious. Looking around at the current state of the Rhineland family, Klein could not help wondering whether this miserable situation was truly the future Burkel had sacrificed his life to protect. Soon afterward, Delane and Heinkel departed from the arena, with Delane politely saying goodbye to Klein before leaving. Once they were gone, Dalton from the collateral branch approached Klein directly and mockingly asked whether a young master of the Rhineland family truly could not even use a sword. He sneered that Klein acted arrogantly simply because he belonged to the direct bloodline despite being nothing more than a disgrace. However, Klein calmly countered by asking whether secretly seducing girls behind the scenes during noble balls was something the family should feel proud of instead. Dalton's expression immediately twisted in shock and rage, as he demanded to know how Klein had learned about that secret. Rather than answering, Klein coldly remarked that paying those girls to remain silent clearly had not worked very well, adding that he genuinely could not tell whether Dalton was simply naive or completely stupid. Furious, Dalton raised his fist and charged forward, while demanding to know how Klein dared spout such nonsense. Yet before he could land a hit, Klein suddenly stepped to Dalton's side with precise movement before tripping him effortlessly and sending him crashing onto the ground. As Klein calmly walked away, he casually remarked that Dalton was merely venting his frustration because Delane had humiliated him earlier. However, before Klein could leave completely, Dalton suddenly shouted that Klein was nothing more than an illegitimate brat who did not even know his own mother. Hearing those words caused Klein to immediately stop. Slowly turning around, he coldly demanded that Dalton repeat what he had just said. The terrifying expression on Klein's face instantly silenced Dalton, yet Klein's anger had nothing to do with the mother he had never met. What truly enraged him was the blatant contempt these people held toward the direct bloodline, along with their disgusting sense of superiority. Deep inside, he could not help wondering how the family of the hero who defeated him had fallen this low. Before the situation escalated further, a knight suddenly stepped between them and firmly warned Dalton that he would not tolerate any more disrespect toward the young master. Dalton clicked his tongue in annoyance before retreating while mockingly declaring that Klein was only acting brave because his knight was nearby. As he left, Dalton angrily shouted at the surrounding crowd, demanding to know what they were staring at. At that moment, Klein's gaze slowly shifted toward Dunkel's sword. Calmly, he asked whether the knight happened to have a spare blade. The scene then shifted outside the hall where Dunkel handed a practice sword over to Klein, while asking why he needed a sword at this hour. Klein slowly began swinging the blade while attempting to imitate the movements Delane had displayed earlier. Watching this caused Dunkel to ask whether Klein was trying to replicate the meteor sword technique. Klein quietly confirmed it before explaining that there was something he wanted to verify for himself, instructing Dunkel to leave him alone for a moment. Deep down, Dunkel believed Klein still carried lingering regrets about the sword. However, he also knew it was already too late for him. Klein possessed no mana, and anyone incapable of using mana could never become a knight. Furthermore, the meteor sword was a secret art personally created by the Duke himself. Even if someone could imitate the sword's movement, reproducing the technique itself should have been impossible. Yet Klein simply closed his eyes and began recalling the strangely vivid memories he had observed earlier. He copied the footwork, the timing of the acceleration, the exact trajectory of the blade, and even the flow of mana itself. In the next instant, purple energy crackled violently within Klein's eyes. The sudden surge of mana was so overwhelming that Dunkel immediately sensed it and turned back in disbelief. The moment he looked behind him, his eyes widened completely in shock. Klein was using mana. Not only that, he had perfectly reproduced the same swordsmanship Delane had displayed earlier. With a single swing of his blade, Klein cleanly sliced a massive boulder in half. Dunkel immediately rushed back toward him and demanded to know whether he had truly just witnessed Klein using mana. Yet Klein himself remained completely speechless, unable to believe that he had actually succeeded or that the technique had truly worked at all. Meanwhile, when the day of the purification ritual finally arrived, Erin was far more worried about her young master than usual. On the other hand, Veerman could barely believe the sight unfolding before him. As Klein's head remained submerged inside a bucket filled with holy water, Veerman calmly remarked that Klein was now capable of holding his breath underwater for more than an entire minute. Hearing that immediately excited Erin, who innocently asked whether her young master had completely turned into a fish by now. The moment she mentioned fish, Veerman seriously wondered aloud if they should conduct the next purification ritual inside an actual fish tank instead. However, before the priest could continue his ridiculous imagination, Klein suddenly burst upward from the bucket, while shouting in frustration and demanding to know why the purification ritual was taking even longer than usual today. Yet instead of responding angrily, Veerman simply informed him that the ritual was already finished for the day. The priest then added with an unsettling laugh that, for some reason, he had sensed an ominous aura coming from Klein's room earlier that morning. Klein immediately questioned what he even meant by ominous aura, and wondered if Veerman simply enjoyed tormenting him with absurd excuses. As Irene handed him a towel, Dunkel suddenly entered the room and informed Klein that Lord Dalton had sent him an invitation. Klein immediately asked who exactly had sent the letter, and Dunkel explained that it was Dalton, the same collateral branch noble who had sparred against Lord Delane during the recent swordsmanship exhibition. He also mentioned that Dalton apparently wished to apologize for the incident that happened at the training grounds. However, Klein silently wondered whether that bastard truly intended to apologize for anything at all. Upon reading the contents of the letter, Klein discovered that Dalton wanted to hold a hunting competition. Even so, Klein immediately found the entire situation suspicious. After causing such a commotion at the training grounds only a few days earlier, Dalton suddenly inviting him to a hunting event clearly felt unnatural. In Klein's mind, Dalton most likely just needed an excuse to lure him away from the estate. Dunkel then asked whether Klein intended to attend the event at all, but Klein calmly replied that there was no reason for him to refuse. As his eyes drifted toward the sword resting nearby, he quietly informed Dunkel that he happened to possess an ace hidden up his sleeve. Klein then reflected on how he had continuously replayed Delane's swordsmanship in his mind, ever since the exhibition ended, eventually realizing something strange. Although he could imitate techniques after seeing them once, he could not perfectly replicate every single one without limitation, and even he did not understand why. Dunkel nodded and stated that he would prepare the carriage immediately, but before he could leave, Veerman suddenly appeared once again and asked whether Klein truly intended to participate in a hunting competition. The priest then casually wondered if he should accompany him as well. Hearing that immediately caused Klein to shout in disbelief while asking what kind of nonsense the priest was planning this time. However, Veerman merely reminded him that he had already mentioned earlier how he sensed an ominous aura surrounding Klein that day. As they departed aboard the carriage, Aren was already lying down comfortably with her head resting on Veerman's lap. Seeing this instantly irritated Klein, who threw a pillow directly at the priest before telling Aren that she should not have come at all. He explained that the western forest was rough and dangerous, making the trip difficult for anyone unprepared. Klein then gently told Aren that she would feel better after getting some sleep while Veerman silently listened nearby. Suddenly, the priest nearly burst into tears while wondering when exactly young Master Klein had grown into such a considerate young man. Yet Klein immediately clarified that the pillow was only meant for Aren, adding that he would never show concern for someone like Veerman. Afterward, Klein quietly stared out through the carriage window and noticed just how much the world had changed over the past 2 centuries. During his own era, these lands had been covered in nothing but snow, blood, and countless corpses scattered across endless battlefields. Now, however, those same frozen lands had transformed into peaceful green plains full of life. Looking at the flourishing scenery outside, Klein could not help but wonder if this was the world Berkel Rhineland had fought so desperately to protect. After some time passed, Dunkel informed Klein that they had finally arrived at the Conwell estate. As Klein stepped out and observed the surroundings, he immediately realized that this was where Dalton lived, and the place itself was even more extravagant than the main Rhineland estate, despite the Rhineland family being one of the 3 great houses of the empire. For what was supposedly nothing more than a simple hunting competition among young nobles, the Conwell family certainly seemed to possess an absurd amount of wealth to waste. Just then, Dalton approached Klein alongside several hunting dogs, while asking what exactly he was staring at so seriously. He mockingly pointed out the high ceilings and thick walls of the estate before proudly stating that all of it had been built using the money squeezed out from the direct Rhineland bloodline. Dalton then sneered that Klein had spent 7 years rotting inside a monastery, and therefore could not possibly understand how the world truly worked. Klein quietly noticed that the hunting dogs looked horribly emaciated before asking, since when hunting competitions had become social gatherings. Dalton merely called him impatient, before revealing that he had prepared all of this specifically because he knew Klein would enjoy it. Without warning, Dalton suddenly released the starving hunting dogs into the forest, before announcing the start of the competition. He explained that bait had been scattered throughout the mountains, and that the sense of smell possessed by starving hunting dogs was tens of thousands of times sharper than that of ordinary humans. Driven mad by hunger and scent, the beasts would endlessly roam the mountains searching for food. Immediately afterward, the nobles prepared their bows and began firing arrows relentlessly toward the starving dogs, slaughtering them one after another while laughing like maniacs, and proudly calling it a successful hunt. However, amid the chaos, Dalton suddenly noticed Aren wandering nearby while rubbing her eyes and searching for Klein. Dalton slowly approached her before casually patting her head and asking whether she was the maid. Klein constantly dragged around everywhere. He mockingly wondered what someone as small and useless as her could possibly do for Klein, before suggesting that she come along with him instead, because he had another job for her. Yet before Dalton could continue, Klein suddenly grabbed his wrist tightly and coldly, ordered him to remove his hand from Aren before he broke it entirely. Dalton had no choice but to obey. As he pulled away, he deliberately bumped shoulders with Klein and told him to stop pretending to act tough. Soon afterward, Dalton mounted his horse and ordered Klein to follow him. As Klein prepared to ride after him, he quietly instructed Dunkel to remain behind with Aaron and not follow them into the forest. Dunkel immediately objected, insisting that it was too dangerous for Klein to go alone. However, Klein suddenly revealed a signal, magic scroll. A signal magic scroll was a one-time use magical item capable of transmitting emergency signals, even to those incapable of using mana. The moment the paper was torn apart, the linked crest would react and notify its paired owner immediately. Klein then informed Dunkel that the bastard priest following them around was already suspicious enough, and if Veerman suddenly disappeared, it would certainly mean something had gone wrong. Dunkel asked what exactly Klein meant by that, but instead of explaining further, Klein simply instructed him to tear the scroll the moment Veerman vanished. Once activated, the linked crest would appear on the back of Klein's hand and alert him instantly. As Klein rode deeper into the hunting grounds, Veerman silently observed everything from afar without saying a single word. By the time Klein finally reached the hunting grounds proper, evening had already begun to descend over the forest. In his mind, Dalton could not have traveled very far ahead, and if he simply followed the trail through the woods, he would eventually find him. Moments later, Klein discovered Dalton sitting calmly atop the corpse of a dead hunting dog, while countless other carcasses lay scattered around the forest floor. Dalton slowly licked the blood staining his sword before calling out to Klein and mockingly asking why he had arrived so late. Klein immediately stepped down from his horse and demanded to know what kind of game Dalton was trying to play. As he glanced toward the dead hunting dogs littering the ground, even Klein found himself disgusted enough to curse under his breath. Dalton simply questioned what he meant, before proudly declaring that this was the grand finale of today's hunt, and that the final prey he intended to kill was Klein himself. Klein calmly asked whether Dalton was truly certain about what he was saying. Dalton confidently declared that he intended to cut off Klein's head and throw it directly before Delane, while proving to everyone that the Rhineland family was nothing more than an empty shell, lacking both power and justification. He then summoned his hidden men and informed Klein that he would not even be given the chance to struggle before dying. According to Dalton, the dukedom rightfully belonged to the collateral branch families anyway. He sneered that Klein should curse the fact that he had been born into such a pathetic family, because by tomorrow, the entire empire would gossip about how the Northern Sword family's young master died, like dog food inside the forest. Hearing those words caused Klein to once again remember Burkle's conviction about protecting the future of the children. Suddenly, a grin slowly spread across Klein's face before he burst into laughter while covering his eyes. Dalton immediately grew irritated and demanded to know what was so funny, wondering whether Klein had finally lost his mind completely. Klein calmly denied it before raising his head with glowing eyes and a grim expression. He coldly remarked that a reckless brat like Dalton was acting arrogantly without even understanding his own place in the world. The moment Dalton saw Klein's terrifying expression, fear instantly spread across his face as cold sweat began pouring down his body. Klein then declared that the Rhineland family had been built upon the sacrifice of his own life. Yet Dalton still dared insult and mock it so carelessly. At that moment, a blue aura slowly began flowing around Klein, while the sky above gradually turned crimson red. Dalton immediately noticed the strange energy gathering around Klein and questioned whether this was some form of magic, despite Klein supposedly possessing no mana at all. Klein calmly informed him that it was not magic, but magi. A terrifying surge of power immediately spread throughout the forest, causing Dalton's lackeys to panic while asking what exactly Klein even was. Suddenly, Dalton seemed to realize something horrifying as he remembered the word Klein had just spoken. Magi was not ordinary magic. It was an ancient power tied directly to forbidden necromancy. With a grim voice echoing through the forest, Klein called upon the ancient evil spirits buried beneath the passage of time and declared that he would raise them once more into the light. From that moment onward, in his name, he commanded them to awaken again. The instant those words were spoken, glowing green skeletons slowly emerged from the darkness surrounding the forest. Dalton's eyes widened in absolute terror as cold fear consumed his entire body. Standing before him was no longer the weak second son of the Rhineland family. The being before him was unmistakably Archmund himself. Meanwhile, Klein calmly ordered his undead summons to devour every last one of them, until not even their resentful souls remained behind. Archmund once believed that he had already forgotten everything, but at that moment, the entire 200 years separating his past and present suddenly felt like nothing more than a blur of distant memories. More importantly, he could feel it once again, the voices endlessly resonating from deep within the darkness. The whispers of the dead were calling out to him once more. That familiar sensation, that dreadful resonance, the pulse flowing through his soul, the traces left behind by countless deaths, the memories buried beneath time, and even the nostalgia he thought had vanished forever all returned to him at once. Dalton could not believe what he was witnessing before his eyes. He knew this should have been impossible, yet he still found himself trembling as he asked whether the person standing before him was truly Archmund. Without hesitation, Klein calmly confirmed it, and stated that he had once been called by that name. The moment those words left his mouth, the entire forest fell silent. Everyone could only mutter the name Archmund beneath their breath, until one of the men finally questioned whether the rumors surrounding Klein had actually been true all along. Their gazes then shifted toward the strange creatures standing beside him, and they demanded to know what exactly those monsters were. Another heavy silence followed as they waited for an answer. Yet suddenly, the group burst into loud laughter like madmen, and mocked the strange skeletons standing around Klein. They ridiculed the bucket-like helmets covering their heads, and questioned whether Klein had acted so arrogantly, only to summon such low-level trash. Klein quietly asked whether they had truly just called his summons trash. Dalton immediately confirmed it, and proudly claimed that he had smashed hundreds of skeletons like those during missions before. However, one of Dalton's lackeys suddenly hesitated, and questioned why these skeletons looked so strange compared to ordinary undead. He pointed out the black-colored bones covering their bodies, but another man simply dismissed the concern, and suggested that they each take a bone as a souvenir after killing them all. Dalton immediately laughed and praised the idea before ordering his men to eliminate the skeletons blocking their path. He instructed the ranged units to prepare their weapons and fire immediately. Without delay, a rain of arrows flew toward Klein and his undead army. Yet throughout the entire barrage, Klein did not move even a single inch and merely watched the arrows descend upon him. As the arrows struck the ground, Dalton and his men laughed loudly, believing that Klein had already been turned into a bloody corpse. However, Dalton's expression suddenly froze in disbelief. Not only had the arrows been completely blocked, but Klein's skeletons had somehow pulled out shields to protect him. Klein calmly remarked that 200 years was apparently a very long time, because he never expected that nobody would recognize his skeleton soldiers anymore. The lackey stared in confusion and demanded to know where the shields had suddenly appeared from, since the skeletons had not possessed them moments earlier. Klein explained that if his summons had been ordinary skeletons, their surprise would have made sense, but his undead were completely different. Dalton's eyes widened in shock once again as Klein calmly ordered his summons to disengage the first defensive formation and prepare for a full assault. The undead immediately shifted formations with perfect discipline before charging forward. In Klein's mind, he silently called out toward Burkle Rhineland and demanded that the hero watch carefully. The future of the North that Burkle had chosen to protect at the cost of Archman's own life had now become nothing more than arrogant fools who mocked and insulted the very family built upon sacrifice. Klein once again demanded that Burkle witness with his own eyes how those descendants would now be crushed beneath his hands. As the skeletons charged into battle, Dalton's entire group froze in shock, because none of them expected skeletons to move with such speed. Dalton immediately shouted for everyone not to panic, and ordered them to maintain formation, insisting that their enemies were merely skeletons. But the moment the battle truly began, one man after another was cut cleanly in half by Klein's undead soldiers. Dalton's lackeys screamed in agony while begging for help, while Dalton himself could barely move from where he stood. He cursed Klein repeatedly while desperately shouting for his men to hold formation no matter what. Yet before they could recover, Klein calmly ordered his second crossbow unit to surround the enemy, lock onto the targets, and prepare to fire. The moment Dalton's men realized that the skeletons even possessed ranged attackers, panic completely erupted among them. Some immediately shouted for everyone to run, but Klein coldly gave the order to fire. Instantly, countless arrows shot through the air and pierced directly through flesh, throats, and skulls, until bodies collapsed lifelessly onto the ground. As the melee battle continued, Dalton's entire body trembled uncontrollably. Everything he was witnessing completely defied the undead he thought he understood. He quickly realized that it was only a matter of time before his entire force was annihilated, so he ordered everyone to abandon the crossbows, stop reloading, and switch to close combat instead. However, nobody listened anymore, because each person was already too busy trying to survive. With a grim smile on his face, Dalton suddenly swung his sword downward and decapitated one of the skeletons, cursing the undead creature as its skull rolled across the ground. Dalton laughed loudly afterward and shouted that he knew aiming for the head would kill a skeleton instantly. Yet in the very next moment, the headless skeleton suddenly swung its sword directly toward him. Dalton barely managed to dodge at the last second before collapsing backward in panic. As he quickly scrambled back onto his feet, he muttered in disbelief that he had definitely cut its head off. Klein calmly explained that most people naturally assumed a skeleton would stop moving once its head was severed, but as he already said before, his skeletons were different. The decapitated undead calmly picked up its own head before reattaching it to its neck. As the bones regenerated and fused together once more, Klein explained that this very ability was the primary reason why Archman had once been able to sweep across the continent and plunge the world into terror. Dalton could only stand frozen in silence as he watched the skeleton casually reattach its own head. Klein then further explained that his skeletons, being summoned through true necromancy, did not die easily. Every single one of them obeyed orders without hesitation and moved according to carefully organized tactical formations. One bald mercenary shouted in terror while demanding to know what kind of monsters these things were and why they refused to stay dead. Klein quietly remarked that with his current body, his limit for summons was only 11 skeletons for now, before calmly asking whether they wished to continue the battle any longer. Soon afterward, screams once again echoed throughout the forest. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Veerman and Aaron sat beside a fountain while laughing together peacefully. Erin suddenly asked whether her young master had really done the things Veerman previously described from his monastery days. Veerman calmly confirmed it, explaining that the story came from when Klein had still been imprisoned at the monastery. Erin burst into laughter and declared that it sounded hilarious, but Veerman suddenly fell silent afterward. He then quietly remarked that Erin seemed genuinely fond of her young master. Erin paused for a moment before shyly admitting that she truly was. She then explained that Veerman had no idea just how incredible young Master Klein really was. While the battle continued deep within the forest, Erin happily spoke about how kind and gentle Klein was, mentioning how he always shared his cookies with her. To Erin, Klein was the warmest person in the entire world. Meanwhile, as Klein's skeleton army continued slaughtering Dalton's men, Dalton himself desperately kept swinging his sword and decapitating skeleton after skeleton, only for them to calmly pick up their heads and reattach them repeatedly. Dalton cursed the undead endlessly while muttering to himself that if only he could somehow stop their regeneration, the battle would become easy. Then suddenly, his eyes landed upon Klein standing calmly in the distance. At that moment, Dalton realized that if he killed Klein, the skeletons should disappear alongside him. Without hesitation, he dashed through the battlefield and leapt past the undead soldiers before launching himself directly toward Klein. He declared that this game of playing with corpses ended now, because undead or not, everything would be over the moment Klein died. As Dalton swung his sword toward Klein's neck, he screamed for him to die. Yet at that exact moment, Klein's eyes suddenly shone with a glowing purple light. As energy crackled around him, Klein realized that through the strange power dwelling within his eyes, he could now perceive the flow of mana itself. Because he could perfectly recall techniques he had seen before, he once again activated the Rhineland family's secret swordsmanship, the Meteor Sword. In an instant, Klein's body moved exactly like Delane's had during the exhibition. His footwork, timing, sword path, and flow of mana all aligned perfectly. Before Dalton could even react, Klein's blade flashed through the air and sliced directly across his body. Klein coldly declared that Dalton should not expect a peaceful death, because from that moment onward, his judgment had finally begun. While Dalton lay on the ground coughing blood, Klein quietly admitted that Dalton had actually been correct about one thing. If the caster dies, every creation born from necromancy loses its power, and in the end, Archmond himself had once been defeated, because he failed to overcome that very weakness. Klein then reflected on how strange fate truly was. Even after being reborn, he still retained the power of necromancy through demonic energy, yet now it was the power of the Rhineland bloodline that allowed him to protect himself. The blood of the very enemy who once killed him had ironically made him stronger. Klein then informed Dalton that ever since he was born into this new body, he could no longer turn a blind eye to what was happening around him. Dalton tried desperately to ask what Klein meant by those words, but before he could finish speaking, his final breath escaped his body. Klein then silently called out toward Burkle once more, and declared that he should simply wait and watch, because he himself would rebuild the ruined house that Burkle died protecting. Suddenly, Dalton opened his eyes in an unfamiliar place consumed entirely by darkness. He immediately questioned where he was, unable to see anything around him. Moments later, he felt a strange pressure restraining his body, and in that instant, he realized he had been bound tightly to a spiked torture chair. Fear and confusion instantly spread across his face. Then, from within the darkness, a shadowy silhouette slowly approached and calmly remarked that he had finally awakened. As the figure stepped into view, Archmond revealed himself and informed Dalton that this was the place where souls arrived after leaving the world of the living. It was an afterlife personally created by Archmond himself. Dalton immediately questioned whether the man before him was truly Archmond and whether this place was really the afterlife. Archmond calmly confirmed both without hesitation. He then reminded Dalton of how he had starved and tortured hunting dogs for amusement while they were alive, and how he habitually committed cruelty under the excuse of hunting. Archmond stated that he still remembered the joy visible on Dalton's face every time he inflicted suffering upon helpless creatures. Dalton shouted back in anger and confusion, demanding that Archmond at least make sense if he intended to spout nonsense, and threatened that if this did not stop immediately, he would kill him himself. However, in the next moment, Dalton suddenly remembered being cut down by Klein's sword. Shocked, he immediately questioned why his body appeared completely unharmed now. Archmond calmly explained that Dalton was already dead, and that everything happening now was simply the return of the karma he accumulated throughout his life. According to Archmond, that was the true purpose of this afterlife. Still refusing to believe any of it, Dalton desperately demanded that Archmond stop talking about nonsense like the afterlife, and simply let him go. Yet Archmond merely responded that Dalton's belief no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered now was that the time had finally come for him to pay for every sin he committed while alive. At that moment, the corpses of the dead hunting dogs slowly emerged from the surrounding darkness. Fear immediately struck Dalton as the creatures approached him. Archmond then ordered him to listen carefully to the screams of every life he had taken, and remember that this hell was one he personally created for himself. As the beasts lunged toward him, Dalton screamed in despair while experiencing the pain born from his own cruelty. Crying and begging for mercy as tears streamed down his face, Dalton finally realized that his fate had already been sealed forever within that endless darkness. Back in the real world, Dalton's corpse lay completely motionless on the ground after the battle finally ended. Klein quietly observed the aftermath with a cold expression as the wind swept through the blood-stained forest around him. At that moment, he noticed his skeletal soldiers still standing nearby. Turning toward them, Klein quietly stated that since they had answered his call, it was only fair that he repay the favor. He then activated his necromancy and declared that as a reward for aiding him, he would now break the curse binding their souls and finally grant them freedom. A bright green light immediately shone throughout the forest as the spirits trapped within the skeletons were released from their chains before peacefully vanishing into the night sky. Klein stood there silently for several moments afterward, trying to understand what exactly had changed inside his heart after all this time. He quietly thought to himself that death was supposed to mean bones crumbling away and scattering with the wind, so he could not understand why he himself had returned to life or what purpose his second chance was truly meant to serve. Then, suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness and remarked that he never expected young Master Klein to be a necromancer. Klein instantly realized that this unknown person had witnessed everything. He immediately questioned the stranger's identity, but the man simply answered that Klein neither needed to know nor would understand, even if he were told. As the mysterious figure raised his hand, green energy radiated from his palm. The man explained that even if he revealed his name, Klein would still fail to understand what was truly happening. In the next instant, the green aura spread across the corpses scattered around the battlefield, causing their eyes to suddenly glow unnaturally. With a simple gesture, the stranger began raising every fallen body around them. Klein immediately recognized the technique as soul return magic, a form of necromancy capable of controlling corpses. At once, he realized that the man standing before him was also a necromancer. The mysterious man calmly remarked that although Dalton had failed, the corpses surrounding them would still prove useful before laughing loudly throughout the forest. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Aaron excitedly asked Dunkel to listen to more stories about young Master Klein's childhood because she found them hilarious. However, while staring at the signal scroll in his hand, Dunkel quietly responded that he would listen later instead. He wondered why Klein had specifically brought along an emergency item like a signal magic scroll in the first place. 3 entire hours had already passed since Klein entered the forest alongside Dalton, yet there was still no news whatsoever. Dunkel admitted that he had a very bad feeling about the situation. Unable to wait any longer, Dunkel began walking toward his horse, and decided that he needed to find Klein immediately. However, 2 knights suddenly rushed forward and blocked his path. They insisted that it would create problems if he abandoned his post now, while the other reminded him that the hunting competition was technically still ongoing and suggested waiting a little longer. Dunkel remained silent for a moment as he noticed the crest of the Conwell family displayed on the knight's armor. Immediately, he realized that these men were likely Dalton's personal guards. Understanding that something suspicious was happening, Dunkel coldly informed them that he was the knight commander of the Rhineland family and the personal guard of young Master Klein. He warned them that if they continued obstructing his path, he would not remain idle any longer, making it perfectly clear what he meant. The 2 knights immediately became frightened and fell silent. Aaron then nervously asked Dunkel whether something was wrong. Instead of answering directly, Dunkel calmly told her to listen carefully. He explained that young Master Klein was taking far too long to return, so he intended to search for him personally. He then instructed Aaron to return to the estate together with the priest. However, Aaron suddenly informed him that Veerman had already left earlier. Dunkel was visibly shocked because the priest had disappeared without even saying a single word. He quickly asked when exactly Veerman left, and Aaron responded that the priest had worn an unusually serious expression before departing. She also added that Veerman mentioned his bad feeling had apparently been correct after all. Hearing that immediately caused Dunkel to remember Klein's earlier instructions about tearing the signal scroll apart if the suspicious priest followed him. Cursing under his breath, Dunkel immediately mounted his horse. As he tore apart the signal scroll using his teeth, he realized that none of the events unfolding tonight were mere coincidences. Something terrible was definitely happening to young Master Klein. Back in the mountains, Klein faced the mysterious Necromancer, while realizing that the previous battle had completely exhausted his demonic energy reserves. In his current condition, he could no longer use necromancy for the time being. As the groans of undead creatures echoed around him, Klein understood that his current body would not survive another prolonged fight. The mysterious man then calmly ordered his undead servants to move and eliminate young Master Klein immediately. As the undead army advanced toward him, Klein coldly informed the stranger that he recognized soul return magic and questioned whether the man truly believed he could kill him using the very same necromancy Archmond once mastered. Then suddenly, the crest on Klein's hand began glowing brightly. A smirk appeared across Klein's face as he mocked the mysterious necromancer and calmly declared that he was finished now. The stranger became confused by Klein's confidence, but before he could react, a massive golden light suddenly shot toward the battlefield at incredible speed. In the very next instant, Veerman descended directly in front of Klein and slammed his fist into the ground, while golden energy exploded outward from his body. The resulting shockwave instantly blasted the undead creatures away. As Veerman's eyes glowed brilliantly, he began chanting a holy incantation. Immediately afterward, every undead creature in the area was swallowed entirely by golden light. Once the light faded, Veerman calmly stood up and informed Klein that he could now relax. Meanwhile, the mysterious necromancer stared toward Veerman in shock, before quietly asking whether the man standing before him was truly Veerman, the Holy Order's infamous Agent Garrison. Agents were the 3 human weapons who carried out the Pope's orders with absolute obedience. As the church's strongest assets, they alone possessed the right to wield the holy relics left behind by Saint Gall. It was said that each agent carried the power of an entire fortress, and among them, the one known for possessing the greatest raw strength now stood directly before Klein. The undead immediately charged forward, but before they could even reach him, Veerman smashed one of them in the face with a holy scripture, the impact crushing its skull apart. With a casual wave of his hand, he swung the sacred book again and decapitated another undead in a single strike, all while calmly declaring that sinners should offer their prayers so they could receive a baptism of fire and be cleansed of their sins. Then, like a beast unleashed onto the battlefield, Veerman lunged forward from his position and tore through the remaining undead one after another, proclaiming that this was both mercy and judgment. The mysterious necromancer could only stare in disbelief, unable to understand why an agent of the church had appeared in a place like this, nor how such monstrous strength could possibly exist within a single man. The moment Veerman slowly began walking toward him, the necromancer instinctively turned around and fled deeper into the forest, realizing that fighting Veerman had never been part of the arrangement. He muttered in panic that the priest's power made absolutely no sense. But before he could escape any farther, his body suddenly lifted off the ground after Veerman grabbed him by the head with one hand and asked where exactly he thought he was going. The necromancer's mask fell to the dirt as Veerman tightened his grip with overwhelming force. The terrified man begged him to wait, but Veerman merely stared at him coldly and declared that his prayer was not yet finished, and therefore the man should feel honored, for this judgment had been bestowed upon him in the name of light itself. The moment the prayer ended, the necromancer's head exploded in Veerman's grasp, and the lifeless corpse collapsed heavily onto the ground. Then something rolled across the dirt toward Klein. Looking down, he realized it was the necromancer's eye. As Veerman called out to him, Klein felt his entire body freeze. The priest had only taken a single step earlier. He had merely charged forward once. Yet through nothing but his sheer presence and overwhelming aura, more than 20 bodies had been shredded apart on the spot. Slowly, Veerman extended his blood-covered hand toward Klein, his eyes glowing ominously in the darkness. Klein's pupils immediately shrank as cold sweat rolled down his face, staring at the blood dripping from the priest's fingers. Veerman calmly explained that he had sensed traces of necromancy and rushed over immediately, but strangely enough, the energy he felt did not seem to belong to Archmond. Hearing those words, Klein instantly realized that if he made even the slightest mistake, Veerman was fully prepared to kill him right there. Before the tension could grow heavier, Dunkel suddenly arrived on horseback while shouting Klein's name. He immediately rushed toward him and asked if he was all right, but Klein himself was more shocked by the fact that Dunkel had actually come here. At that exact moment, blood suddenly spilled from Klein's mouth, and he realized that forcing necromancy through his current body had pushed him beyond its limits. Dunkel quickly jumped down from his horse and ran toward him after seeing Klein collapse onto one knee. Panicked, he loudly demanded to know what had happened and why blood was coming out of Klein's mouth, but Klein only frowned and told him that he could hear perfectly fine, asking him to stop shouting already. He then weakly asked Dunkel to support him because his legs had completely given out. When Dunkel questioned him about Dalton's whereabouts, Klein remained silent for a brief moment before finally admitting that he had killed Dalton because Dalton had attempted to kill him first. Sometime later, inside the Rhineland court, a furious man slammed his fist onto the table and demanded an explanation for what he had just heard. This man was Delcon Conwell, Count of the Conwell family, and he angrily questioned whether they were truly accusing Dalton of attempting to assassinate young Master Klein. He insisted that his son had been a loyal and honorable knight, and that it was already bad enough that Dalton had died. Yet now they were supposedly trying to frame him as an assassin, instead of searching for the true culprit. However, the 7th Duke of Rhineland, Heinkel Rhineland, calmly informed him that despite undergoing a long and intense interrogation, Klein had not changed his statement even once. There was also another issue that could not be ignored. Records showed that 20 mercenaries had been dispatched from the Conwell estate during the same time Dalton and Klein disappeared, making it increasingly difficult to deny that Dalton had planned something suspicious. Delcan immediately fell silent, inwardly cursing the fact that evidence had been left behind despite the precautions he had ordered earlier. Still unwilling to surrender, he quickly changed tactics and argued that none of this made any sense. Dalton had already reached the level required to officially join the Knights, while young Master Klein had supposedly never even held a sword before. Murmurs spread throughout the court as people quietly agreed that Klein had no mana and had never once shown any talent as a swordsman. Some began questioning how someone like Klein could possibly kill Dalton. Deep inside, Delcan understood that Dalton's failure could no longer be undone. But if the truth about Dalton attempting to murder a direct descendant came to light, then his own position would also collapse. Desperate, he shifted the discussion toward Klein himself and asked everyone to think carefully about what kind of person young Master Klein truly was. He reminded them that Klein was born from Grand Duchess Claire, a woman surrounded by bizarre rumors until the day she died, and pointed out that Klein himself had claimed to be Archmond ever since childhood. Those words irritated Heinkel, who immediately warned Delcan to watch his tongue, but Delcan only raised his voice louder, saliva flying everywhere as he shouted that the truth was obvious. According to him, Klein, a powerless young master with no talent for the sword, must have secretly hired someone to kill Dalton, and was now attempting to pin the crime on the dead man. He called the entire situation disgusting. Suddenly, another voice interrupted the argument, causing Dunkel to immediately recognize that the speaker was young Master Klein himself. Klein calmly stated that he had listened long enough, and that Delkin had been spewing nonsense for quite some time now. He directly declared that Dalton truly had hired mercenaries to murder him, and that he had simply defended himself. He further explained that a mysterious individual had appeared afterward, and used necromancy to raise the dead, before Agent Veerman of the Holy Order arrived, and dealt with the situation personally. Delkin furiously shouted that everything Klein said was a lie, but Klein coldly asked whether he truly wished to claim that even the involvement of Veerman was fabricated. Then, with an unreadable expression, Klein casually questioned whether Delkin also believed the rumors about him being Archmond were true. Deep inside his mind, Klein remembered the vow he had made after killing Dalton. He had promised that he would personally restore the family built upon his own death, and because of that, he would never allow parasites like these collateral branches to continue defiling it. The first step, naturally, would be crushing the vermin who dared challenge him. Just then, a knock echoed through the courtroom doors. Moments later, a woman with brilliant golden hair entered the chamber and calmly apologized for arriving late, introducing herself as Laya, commander of the Blue Holy Spear Knights. Klein immediately recognized her as the knight who had attended the swordsmanship demonstration earlier, and wondered why she had appeared here now. One of the collateral branch nobles quickly protested that this issue had nothing to do with the Fallwyvern family, but Heinkel interrupted and explained that he personally granted her permission to attend. Since Dalton had previously served under Laya's knight order during several missions, she possessed every right to participate in the discussion. As one of her subordinates removed her cape, Laya's eyes briefly met Klein's, and after a moment of silence, she calmly requested permission to speak with young Master Klein privately. Heinkel immediately allowed it as long as it would not take long, and instructed Klein to go. Meanwhile, Klein could only sigh inwardly, wondering why knights always seem to complicate everything. However, after calming his thoughts, he quickly realized that this situation was actually an opportunity. In his eyes, there were only 3 possible reasons why Laya wanted to speak with him alone: verification, suspicion, or a test. But regardless of which one it was, Klein no longer had any intention of running away. Now that he finally possessed a purpose, he intended to move forward no matter what. Whether it was the Fallwyvern family or anyone else standing before him, he fully intended to use every single one of them to his advantage. Inside the room, Laya suddenly stepped forward and planted one foot onto the chair, and slowly she leaned closer, her lips parting ever so slightly as her gaze locked onto him with overwhelming intensity. Then, without hesitation, she moved one of her legs between his position and the wall behind him, completely cornering him in place before pressing him back against the cold surface. With almost no distance left between them, Laya calmly asked if she could touch Klein's body. At that moment, sweat immediately formed across Klein's face as his thoughts spiraled into complete confusion. He genuinely could not tell whether Laya was being serious anymore. Laya Wren Paulwyvern was the eldest daughter of the Paulwyvern family, one of the continent's 3 great duchies alongside Rhineland, and the master of spearmanship who commanded the Blue Sacred Spear Knights. Her official records were famous throughout the Empire. During the Western Forest monster suppression operation, while leading a search mission to secure civilian safety, Knight Commander Laya single-handedly exterminated a high-ranking monster without assistance. That achievement alone had already turned her into a living legend among young knights. Standing before Klein now, Laya instructed Klein to follow her outside. Klein told Leia that is coming, but as they walk, Leia told him not to act friendly, because they aren't even real family anyway. Klein then remembered when he was told that his aunt is Duke Paulwyvern's second wife, so Laya is his cousin. But Klein know that Leia is the daughter of the first wife, meaning, biologically speaking, they don't share a single drop of blood, and they are strangers. Suddenly, Laya told him that from here on, everything that will happen was just her personal curiosity. Klein, who had spent years locked away in a monastery and had never once experienced this kind of situation before, immediately became flustered and wondered what exactly she meant by touching him and why she suddenly wanted to do something like that. But before he could think further, Laya grabbed his hand without hesitation. Slowly, she examined each of his fingers one by one while observing the texture of his skin. She noticed how smooth and soft his hands were, completely free of scars, blisters, or hardened skin, almost like the hands of a child who had never worked a day in his life. While Klein stood there confused about why she was feeling his hands so carefully, Laya calmly explained that well-trained swordsmen often did not possess obvious calluses anymore. Instead, the hardened areas formed in specific places, such as beneath the index finger where the sword hilt rested, or near the thumb where pressure constantly accumulated. Tendons, unlike appearances, could never lie. Klein then asked her what conclusion she had reached now. In response, Laya suddenly stepped closer until their faces were only inches apart, her sharp eyes directly confronting his, as she asked whether he truly had never wielded a sword before. With her posture dangerously intimate, she explained that there was absolutely no trace of swordsmanship in his hands, yet somehow he claimed to have defeated Dalton, an official knight, alongside 20 mercenaries, and even survived the encounter himself. She then quietly questioned whether he had used some other kind of power instead. At that moment, Klein abruptly pushed her away and accused her of suddenly speaking nonsense, asking if she intended to question whether he was Archman too. Deep inside, however, Klein understood that this woman was dangerous. Her curiosity was not simple curiosity at all. The look in her eyes was carefully observing his reactions, rather than waiting for answers. He knew that silence would be treated as admission, while hesitation would only become confirmation. If that was the case, then the easiest way to deal with someone like her was to act even more confidently than the person probing him. So instead, Klein boldly asked what she would do if he truly was Archman. To his surprise, Leia suddenly burst into laughter and casually remarked that such a thing was impossible, asking how a brat like him could ever be Archman. Klein immediately froze in silence. After such an intense and intimate atmosphere, being called a brat dealt critical damage to his pride. His entire body trembled in irritation as he asked if she truly had nothing better to call him besides brat. However, Leia denied teasing him and continued mercilessly, pointing out that he was too small to be called a man anyway. According to her, his proportions were terrible, his voice lacked presence, and his build contained no intimidation whatsoever. In other words, he was simply a brat, and more specifically, a very small brat. Klein remained completely frozen, silently suffering from what he considered devastating internal damage. Yet just as he struggled to recover, Leia casually added that he was clearly neither Archman nor a proper swordsman, and if someone like him truly managed to defeat an official knight, then she would even be willing to offer him her lips. Those words instantly left Klein speechless. He could no longer understand what kind of conversation this had turned into. His thoughts spiraled into complete confusion as he tried to figure out whether this was some kind of political maneuver, a provocation, or outright bribery. Unfortunately, his already damaged mental state prevented him from thinking rationally anymore. As Leia began walking away, she simply told him to hurry inside because they were about to be late. But before entering, she quietly whispered something to him regarding Archmond, causing Klein's expression to darken slightly. Moments later, someone announced the arrival of Lady Leia and young Master Klein as the two re-entered the courtroom together. While walking back inside, Klein admitted inwardly that he had become too complacent. In the eyes of others, he was merely the troublesome second son who had spent 7 years imprisoned by the Holy Order. Naturally, nobody would believe his claims about killing Dalton in self-defense, without proof. The 7th Duke then asked what the two of them had discussed, but before Leia could answer, Klein suddenly drew his sword. The loud sound of steel striking the floor echoed across the entire chamber as he plunged the blade into the ground with force, instantly silencing everyone present. Klein realized that the only thing he needed now was proof. Turning toward Delkin Conwell, he directly called him by name and declared that there was no need to drag this matter out any longer. According to Klein, they should settle everything the Northern way, through a trial by combat. Delcan immediately asked what exactly he meant by that. Trial by combat was an ancient northern judicial custom, used whenever a verdict could not easily be reached. There were no restrictions regarding weapons, abilities, or techniques, and the result of the duel itself determined the truth. Simply put, the two sides would fight, and the victor's claim would become absolute. Sweat slowly rolled down Delkin's face as he nervously commented that this proposal was incredibly sudden, and questioned why Klein wanted such a thing. Klein calmly answered that there were plenty of reasons. Despite evidence suggesting Dalton had attempted to murder him first, Delkin still tried to frame him while insulting both him and his mother in the process. Of course, only half of that truly mattered to Klein. He carried the name Klein now, but in reality, he was still Archman, and he held no real attachment to the mother of this second life. Even so, the insults directed toward the direct bloodline were unacceptable. Delkin continued, insisting that the matter was too sudden, but Klein coldly urged him to stop stalling and decide already instead of wasting everyone's time. The nobles around them began whispering among themselves in excitement, amazed that someone still remembered the ancient tradition. It had been years since a true trial by combat had taken place, making the entire court eager to witness it. The 7th Duke then solemnly declared that since trial by combat was a tradition passed down since the first generation of Rhineland, it could not simply be ignored. As the 7th Duke of Rhineland, he formally announced that the duel's outcome would determine the verdict, and all currently presented evidence would therefore become void. The moment Delkin heard that the evidence would be discarded, his expression subtly changed. To him, this became an opportunity. He immediately questioned whether this was truly acceptable, reminding everyone that young Master Klein supposedly possessed no mana at all. He then announced that he intended to send another knight to represent him instead. Inwardly, Delcan had already decided that Klein would die during this duel no matter what. However, Klein calmly responded that it did not matter who Delcan sent. He would simply demonstrate exactly how he butchered Dalton. With a grim expression, Delcan finally accepted the challenge and declared that the duel would take place in 4 days. Meanwhile, Klein quietly reflected that he had not raised the stakes without purpose. This was merely the beginning. Using Delcan as a stepping stone, he intended to show every single branch family exactly who he was, and completely overturn the entire Rhineland household from its rotten foundation. Later that night inside the mansion, Delane openly opposed Klein's decision and demanded to know whether he had completely lost his mind. He questioned whether Klein even understood what he was saying, reminding him that he could very well die in this duel. Klein merely sighed and answered that he already knew, wondering how many times he needed to repeat himself. He also reminded Delane that their father had already granted permission, meaning there was nothing left to argue about. Delane quickly insisted that everything would still be fine because trial by combat allowed for champions, meaning he could simply fight in Klein's place. However, Klein immediately rejected the idea. In his eyes, there was only one reason why the direct line of Rhineland still ruled the north, despite the constant barking and schemes of the collateral branches. It was because they possessed Heinkel Rhineland, the strongest swordsman in the family, and Delane, his genius successor. Klein then questioned whether Delane truly intended to risk himself in a duel that would simply hand their enemies a legal opportunity to kill the future heir of Rhineland. Deep down, Klein understood that Delane's position as heir prevented him from acting freely, and that frustration must be unbearable. But Klein also knew this opportunity was absolutely necessary if he wanted to change the way others saw him. He had no intention of surrendering that chance to anyone else. Delane then quietly admitted that when Klein was first born, he had been so excited to have a younger brother that he rushed over immediately to see him. At that moment, he genuinely believed he was looking at an angel. To Delane, it had never mattered that they had different mothers. He had already lost Klein to the Holy Order once before and spent 7 long years waiting for his return. Now that he had finally gotten his little brother back, Klein suddenly wanted to risk his life in a trial by combat. Unable to hold himself back anymore, Delane pinned Klein against a chair while tears formed in his eyes, desperately trying to make him listen. But before he could continue, Dunkel suddenly entered the room and called for young Master Klein. He apologized for interrupting, then informed them that Count Conwell had already chosen his champion. When Klein asked who it was, Dunkel answered with a grim expression. The champion's name was Randall, an excommunicated knight who had once built a terrifying reputation on the battlefield throughout the Empire. The reason for his expulsion from the knights had been his uncontrollable bloodlust. At that same moment, somewhere inside a tavern littered with unconscious bodies, a massive man slowly gulped down alcohol while muttering about the young master of Rhineland. A twisted grin formed across his face as he commented that it had been a long time since he last heard the screams of a little boy.